number one. He was number one.
I'm gonna have to put it on the
You guys know that reference?
Yeah, I did. What is it?
SpongeBob.
Yeah, what's his name?
Spitty works with something. Yeah.
I grew up in a Baptist church, so it's like call and response, absolutely. My name is Dr. Sarisi West Olutunji, and I am director of Xavier's Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit. And we are co-sponsors of this event. We are so excited to partner with the Jewish Federation of Greater New Orleans and the Office of their Multicultural Affairs. It has been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming out on one of probably the coldest nights yet that we've experienced. So we know that you're dedicated. This is the choir. So we know that this will be a very engaging evening. Thank you for telling other people. I heard that you were sharing. For those of you who listened this morning on WBOK, thank you so much for hearing sort of the preview of what's happening tonight. We're glad that you're on Xavier's campus. So many of you have told me during the reception how beautiful you believe our campus is. You're absolutely right. It's gorgeous, and it's going to become even more gorgeous if that's possible. So stay in touch with us. Please come back to other events that we'll be scheduling. So welcome very much for being here, and thank you once again. I think it's hot. If not, this one is.
Hi, I'm Bradley Bain with the Jewish Federation of Greater New Orleans, and I have the honor today of introducing. Oh, thank you. I'm Bradley Bain with.
Yes.
With the Jewish Federation of Greater New Orleans. The Jewish Federation of Greater New Orleans since 1913 has served as the central address, or organizing address, if you will, for the local Jewish community here. And we're very excited to be partners with Xavier tonight in this important program. The Center for Jewish Multicultural Affairs is an in-house initiative of Federation, sponsored by the Gold Ring Family Foundation, and generously allows us to pursue relationships in 4 separate categories: with Jewish African American affairs, with Jewish Latin American and Latino, LGBTQ, and lastly, interfaith. And with that, I have the honor of introducing our moderator this evening. Wendell Shelby Wallish is a strategic planning specialist with experience in education, program management, and political organizing. Wendell specializes in developing international programs and initiatives that promote justice, peace, and reconciliation. Wendell was born in Houma, Louisiana, and has maintained a steadfast interest in social justice advocacy since high school, when he served as a plaintiff in a federal voting rights lawsuit that changed the course of history in his home parish of Terrebonne. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from Morehouse College. He was inducted into the Academy of Preachers at the 2018 National Festival of Young Preachers. In 2019, Wendell received the Morehouse College Lux Award, awarding his stalwart dedication to the college's mission of service and leadership. Wendell is currently contracted with the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs to advise the Atlanta Consulate and other missions on partnership with the African American community. He previously served as the Director of External Affairs, Strategic Partnership and Initiatives, and the Director of Public Relations at the Consulate General of Israel to the Southeast. Wendell also served as a political organizer in North Carolina, Louisiana, and Virginia, and a disaster recovery specialist with the Louisiana Governor's Division of Administration. When he's not traveling or researching, Wendell enjoys spending time with his funky family.
It is such a privilege to be here tonight, not just in a place that I hold near and dear to me, which is New Orleans, but to be on the campus of Xavier University. As you heard in my bio, I am a Morehouse man, but Xavier University was the first time I was introduced to a historically black college or university. So it is an honor to be here tonight. But this is not about me, and my bio is really boring. This is about a really interesting topic, and I was sharing with some folks at the Federation how this is integral to our discussions that are contemporarily occurring here in the United States. And so we have 2 amazing speakers that we'll hear from tonight. We'll then we'll have a moderated discussion, and then we'll open up the floor for you to ask any questions that you might have. First, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Eva Fogelman, who is a psychologist, filmmaker, and author of the award-winning Conscience and Courage: Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust. She was the co-founder and co-director of Psychotherapy with Generations of the Holocaust and Related Traumas, a training institute for mental health. She's also the founding director of Jewish Foundation for Christian Rescuers. She currently is co-director of Child Development Research, moderates a webinar, Transforming Moments, Second Generation of Holocaust Survivors, Museum of Jewish Heritage, and the podcast, The Blue Card Stories of the Holocaust, Overcoming Historical Traumas. Fogelman is a frequent speaker for general and academic audiences, television, webinars, and radio programs. Let's welcome Dr. Fogelman. Also tonight, we have Sarisi A. West Olatunji. She is the Melba Fortune Martinez Endowed Professor in Counselor Education Program and the Director of the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier University of Louisiana. She's received numerous awards from national organizations and has been recognized as a fellow in the American Counseling Association. Nationally, Dr. West Olatunji has initiated several clinical research projects that focus on traumatic stress and systemic oppression. Her publications include 3 co-authored books, numerous book chapters, and over 50 articles in peer-reviewed journals. Dr. West Olatunji has delivered research papers throughout Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. It's not really a welcome because she's at home, but let us receive Dr. Olatunji. So I think that we should start tonight's discussion by hearing a little bit more from both of you, just briefly about your background, the work that you're doing, and how it relates to tonight's topic. So let's start with you, Dr. Fogelman.
Okay, first I would like to thank Professor Sarisi Olatunji and Aaron Block really for having a vision to host this program on historical and cultural trauma across generations, because it is a topic that certainly has not been covered a lot about African Americans, and a little more time has been spent on Holocaust survivor families. And really a lot of gratitude to all of you who could be watching Thursday night football, and instead you came here. About myself, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. My father was first in a ghetto, then he lived in the woods, and he describes himself as living as an animal, trying to survive the Polish winters in the woods, and then he joined the Belarusian partisans. And my mother came from a small town near Poland, and she and her mother got on a horse and buggy and kept going east. And for 6 months, they were in a Russian labor camp, and then eventually ended up all the way in central Russia, and that's how she survived. And around the mid-1970s, many of you may remember that Roots, Alex Haley's series, was on television. So that it was a time that African Americans were beginning to think about their identity, and it sort of was a motivating force for other young people in their 20s to begin to think about their identity. And there was a group of children of Holocaust survivors who put together a Jewish journal called Response. And in that, there was a dialogue amongst children of Holocaust survivors. And it is that gave myself and my colleague Bella Saverin the idea to begin to start an ongoing group. We made it a short-term 8-week group for children of Holocaust survivors that we started in Boston, and in 1976. At that time, Elie Wiesel had just started teaching the Holocaust at Boston University, and he said when children of survivors could not communicate with their parents about what had happened, they would go and find out from him what they thought their parents went through. And when that wasn't enough, they would then come to the groups to deal with the impact of having grown up with Holocaust survivors And anyway, the rest is history in terms of my work in organizing a conference for children of survivors that then started a whole movement. What I'd like to begin with this evening is first to give a definition of who's a Holocaust survivor, because that then has an effect on who's a second generation, who's a third generation, and a fourth generation. So the definition of Holocaust survivors was actually defined by the German reparation system. In 1983, the Germans were sort of forced into giving reparations to Jews who had lived under their occupation, and also Jews who had lived under the Third Reich in Germany from 1933 till the war started in 1939. So the Germans had their own definition, which was it was only for Jews who were incarcerated in either ghettos or camps for 18 months, which meant that it left out Hungarian Jews, where the Germans only invaded Hungary in March of 1944, and then the war ended by May 7th, 1945, so you didn't even have 18. So a lot of people were left out of that definition, meaning Jews who had escaped, Jews who were in hiding, Jews who were on the run all the time. And a big category that was also left out were people who were children during the Holocaust. So when the early initial criteria for reparations is you had to be interviewed by a German doctor. So could you imagine here, you have to be interviewed to prove that you were injured by a German person who was the one who persecuted you in the first place. And so that even the reparation system became really quite persecutory in terms of, well, you know, what did you suffer 90, you know, you're still suffering 90% or 75%. And the group that was also completely left out were children. So children, when they were asked a question about, so when were you taken out of your home? If you're, you know, 2, 3, 4, even, you know, 15, you're not going to remember the date. And they said, well, if you don't remember, therefore, you were not affected. So that it took quite a few years and before the definition has expanded. So you can see that many children of Holocaust survivors, for example, my mother who had escaped, other people, according to the reparation system, would say, I'm not a child of Holocaust survivors because my mother was not in a concentration camp or a ghetto. Those who left Austria after the Germans invaded in March of '38, which was the Anschluss, if they escaped after that, again, they weren't there very long. So they themselves and their children obviously did not think of themselves as Holocaust survivors. So the definition now has expanded to any Jew who lived under the German occupation. And so that a lot of children of survivors, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, are now identifying with that family history that even though they were emotionally affected by it, they did not have the identification, nor did they have the validation from the outside world. Talking about trauma, a very basic kind of definition is if a person is in a situation that is overwhelming to deal with. And so that is what each Holocaust survivor had experienced. You have somebody coming to your door, you know, with a gun and saying, you know, I'm giving you a half hour to pack. And what do? You have no place to run, you have to pack, and you gotta go. And obviously being in the ghettos or the camps on a daily basis, you didn't know if you were gonna live or die at any particular moment. And so many had experienced a lot of very near-death experiences. They also experienced a lot of death, and they experienced a lot of loss. And in some of the cases, the loss is they saw their parent or they saw their child being, shot to death, or they saw them deteriorate to the point where they became Muslim and were no longer able to eat and sort of had a slow death from hunger. So that not only did you experience persecution, but the aftermath also had to do with the tremendous sense of losses that Holocaust survivors experienced, and you have many who were the only ones who survived in their family. So there are lots of after effects. Some of the individuals obviously were physically ill and had to go to sanatoriums. There were those who had emotional breakdown after when they discovered that nobody was alive in their family. And of course, we get into post-traumatic stress disorder. And so one of the things that is very prevalent with Holocaust survivors is nightmares. And some of them, possibly even up to today, continue to have nightmares. But certainly after the war, they had nightmares on a regular basis. The other effect that is specific to the Holocaust, because they were persecuted as Jews, their Jewish identity. And so you had some individuals who said, because I survived, I am going to become more religious. And, and this will be my way of thanking God for having saved me. Other people felt too ambivalent about God and felt that they could no longer continue to be Jewishly observant in the way that they were before the Holocaust, because they didn't feel this personal connection with trusting and believing in a God who is compassionate. The other, and then you have some rare cases, and those rare cases have to do with individuals who totally denied their Jewishness. In some cases, their children did not even know they were Holocaust survivors. This, by the way, happened particularly in Eastern European countries where they continue to experience anti-Semitism, so they didn't want their children to know that they were Jewish, and they would say to their if they were in Auschwitz and had a number, they would say, we were communists, and that's why, we were in Auschwitz. And then a child would come home when they were a teenager, and they would say, oh, somebody called me a Jude. What's a Jude? And then they had to tell them. So there was a whole resurgence among second generation when they reached their mid-20s or so to begin to discover that they are Jewish. And there are still children of survivors today, believe it or not, who after their parents have died have found out that indeed they were Jewish. Just to tell you one story of a woman who is a Methodist minister at a church on 100th Street in New York, and she's in her 50s and had a daughter who I guess is in her 20s, and one day her daughter calls her late at night and says, you are Jewish. So how do you know? Well, I was just Googling around and I looked up our father, your father's name, and I found him. He was born, they knew he was born in Germany, but, he had He had a Jewish mother and father, and anyway, and then a whole search began. So what do? You're a minister, you're in your 50s, you got a whole church, and you know, and but she went to Germany, to the hometown. She met lots of relatives in South America and in California, and it is now a part of her life. So she is very happy now. Her daughter, who is a lesbian, is with, her partner is a Jewish woman. So she feels there's some sense of Jewish continuity. The other thing that that affected Holocaust survivors after the war, particularly those who came to the United States, is nobody wanted to know what happened to them. And people told them, you're in America now, forget about what happened. You're an American now. Some of the child survivors who were adopted by American families were told, please never mention to our children who were born after that you were in the camps, or you were in hiding during the war. And of course, as a social psychologist, I don't only look at the individual's family background and their socialization and their personalities, but I also look at the impact of societal factors and what effect that has. And the most prevalent effect was that Holocaust survivors were shunned by the Jewish community early on, and there were articles that said in the Saturday Evening Post, which was a very popular magazine, the best people died, and whoever survived must have done something devious in order to survive. So that you have this whole concept of blaming the victim. So in terms of the second generation who were born, those who were born immediately after the war, and that's in the late 40s, the 50s, they grew up with feeling that they don't belong, feeling different. They felt different because they didn't have grandparents or large families for Thanksgiving celebrations or any Jewish holidays. Also during holidays like Yom Kippur, they would see so many candles. The candle represents each person, and they would be so, you know, what are all these candles all about? There was no conversation amongst survivors and their children in the early years, for the most part. So children sort of by osmosis picked up, they would hear their parents talking to friends, oh, what happened to so-and-so, or, you know, so they would hear things about, oh, so-and-so died, or so-and-so starved to death. But you can't really grasp what, in fact, really happened. There were some families where the parents or a relative could not stop talking about what had happened to them. And those children heard a lot of atrocities at a very young age. And obviously, when a child hears such atrocity at a young age, it makes them very, very, very angry. So, so the communication in the family had effects on the second generation. I'm just going to talk about is my time up?
Almost.
Almost, okay. So I'm just going to talk about very quickly about what makes children of Holocaust survivors different from their American Jewish peers. And that has to do with a mourning process. So children of survivors begin, like any mourning process, the shock of finding out something. They don't necessarily know what it is, but it's a sense of shock of, you know, oh, my parents were married before and they lost their spouse or they lost their children. And then people go into a state of denial. Some people remain in a state of denial for their whole life. They don't necessarily ask questions. They don't want to know. There's no sense of feeling they want to be connected in any way to them being children of those who were persecuted as Jews. And then there is a moment where something happens, and all of a sudden a whole new stage begins of confrontation. Somebody might have experienced an anti-Semitic experience, and then it says, oh, so this is what happened, you know, this could lead to what happened to my parents. Or a parent died, or a parent got very sick, and then they realize that they don't know very much about their parents, and all of a sudden they want to find out everything. Very often in these situations, it happens very late, but they continue the confrontation stage by going to Jewish genealogy, or going roots trips, of going to see where their parents came from, or reading a lot of books, or trying to meet people from that community. Now, once you begin this confrontation stage, there are a lot of feelings that get evoked. A sense of helplessness, feeling survivor guilt, feeling like you would like to undo the pain and suffering. A lot of rage happens. And ultimately, all these feelings, if you get stuck in these feelings of, let's say, even identification with the victimization, feeling like you can't enjoy life because you're feeling too guilty, everybody suffered, my parents suffered, I can't really allow myself to enjoy myself. Ultimately, these feelings need to be transformed into and channeled into a search for meaning. And so today we have lots of children of survivors, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, who are involved in Holocaust education and consciousness raising, not only about the persecution of the Jews, but the persecution of any other group. A lot of films are being made by children of Holocaust survivors. Others feel they want to make sure there's a sense of Jewish continuity, and they have a lot of children. Or there's a child of survivors who's brought Yiddish back, which is a language of many of the Eastern European Jews, and the Yiddish theater is flourishing now in New York as a result of a child of Holocaust survivors. I have a lot more to say, but I think I better stop. So I just want to end with the fact that Holocaust survivors have been validated for their suffering, but African Americans have not been validated for their suffering. And in order for traumatized people to be healed, they need a sense of validation from the outside world.
And I think, thank you, Dr. Fogelman. That was a really good introduction to your work and your background. And for those of us who may not be as familiar with the traumas experienced, not just by survivors of the Holocaust, but also by the generations that follow. I want to allow Professor West Olatunji to give a little bit of background into her work and how this all is interconnected.
It is connected, definitely connected. So I want to start with 25 years ago when I was engaged in my dissertation research that really was it really was founded upon a lot of questions that I had as an African American. I acutely felt the difference between the world out there, meaning elementary school, middle school, high school, graduate school, and the world that I lived in my community, in my family, and so on. And I was always trying to reconcile that of, having the benefit of family members and community members who translated what I was learning out there, who helped me to understand what does it have to do with me, and why is it so different. Of trying to understand why it seemed as though the brightest folks who were in my neighborhood were the folks who were mostly oppressed. Those are the folks who were headed to prison. Those are the folks who are getting kicked out of school. And so why is that? Why is it that, from my perspective, these are the brightest people in the community? These are the brightest people in the classroom. Why is that happening? So I always wondered about those things. And so when I had the opportunity to take a look at that, as a doctoral student, I decided I was going to take a look at that and look at what then I called post-traumatic stress disorder, and looking at racism as a correlate to the evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. I wanted to say it caused post-traumatic stress disorder, but I didn't have the means to be able to do that at that time. So 25 years ago, trying to understand this issue, there was only one article that was even close to helping me to explore this. And that article was in Public Health, and it was about the relationship between bias, like systemic bias, and hypertension for Black people. And that's it. That was the closest thing that people were talking about then. But along came this research looking at the children and grandchildren of the Jewish Holocaust experience. And people wanted to know, why was it that the children and grandchildren sometimes had similar trauma symptoms even when they had no knowledge about it? They didn't even know that these people existed. Well, why are they exhibiting these symptoms? What is that about? So that really fascinated me. I really wanted to know then, to understand. And I wasn't alone. Other scholars began asking that question. The next group of people who were looking at this issue, now labeled as intergenerational trauma, were Native American people, so indigenous people. And so there is a lot of research today looking at Native Americans and their experiences. And right after that, we start looking at research coming out about people in the African diaspora who are experiencing similar kinds of things. Now, as you heard Dr. Fogelman, who is, I don't know, a sister that I never knew, she is amazing. She is amazing. And just one day I fall in love with her. So this is the issue, that it's never passed. So we never get to post. Now, I know you know what I'm talking about, particularly those of us from here. Because if I ask you about Hurricane Katrina and somebody wants to say post, you get real upset. There's no post. We're still in it. We're still dealing with it. That is what this is about, of understanding. We never get to post. We just never get there. So it's trauma upon trauma upon trauma, and we constantly deal with it without there being some resolution to what is going on. So now today, with this now 2+ decades of research, we have even more fancy terms. Now we can talk about continuous traumatic stress. And I talk about that a lot. Continuous traumatic stress is important because we don't deal with the post. We are in it. We're still in it. We deal with it all the time. So one is that looking, so the 4 elements of this. One is that our trauma is sudden. Sudden is you're minding your own business, you start your day, and then all of a sudden somebody wants to make some kind of funny comment about who you are and what you're about, or treat you in a different kind of way. And there is this level of threat. And it can be small or it can be large, depending upon what's going on and your perception and your experiences in terms of how you're going to deal with that. The second is that it acknowledges that the environment is not okay till something happens. It says that the environment is toxic before you even get there. It's toxic while you're asleep, right? You wake up to that every day and experience that. So it takes a lot of work to be able to manage and move. I always say it's like sludge, it's like molasses. Like if you want to know what's going on for people who are experiencing that kind of marginalization, it's like walking through sludge every day and people asking, why are you so slow? That's what that is. So it's understanding 4 is that it operates with impunity. So that's understanding what's behind why are we so excited about George Floyd? Why is he so important as a historic character in our sensibilities as human beings, right? Is because we could no longer deny looking, right, at these incidents on our smartphones, on our computers, our tablets, on television, on the news. We couldn't deny that here we have a group of people who are supposed to protect and serve, and they are oppressors. And there are people who've experienced that. So the intergenerational aspect of that is the memory of that is in our bones. We don't have to have real knowledge of what happened before us, what happened before that. We feel it in our bones and become fearful and become angry and become agitated and become depressed. So it's important for us to understand. And then finally, again, this issue of there's no post. It's in the present and it's in the future. So there is the understanding, the reality that even if we all get woke tonight and we all understand what's going on and we agree with what Dr. Fogelman is talking about, we're going to get up tomorrow morning and there are going to be people with attitudes toward us because we're black or we're Jewish or whatever. And so we're going to have to deal with that. So that becomes part of it. And then where do we see it? So I love looking at the research and bringing that out, of talking about what do we know. So now we have the research to look at the empirical evidence of when we look at low birth weight, we can look at that and see the research that says there is a relationship between racism, between systemic racism, not what somebody does to an individual, but how the entire system is structured, right? And it's correlative to low birth weight. It's correlative to premature labor. It's correlative to substance abuse. It's correlative to interpersonal conflicts. It's correlative to all of these things, right, that we deal with. So it's important for us to understand that in terms of both physical health, mental health. It's also about how we're able to self-actualize, right? Again, think sludge, right? So no matter how hard we try, no matter how much we pick ourselves up and we're gonna do it, it's still sludge. We're still moving at incredible. So I always say in talking about intergenerational trauma, and I'm so glad we're talking about this because I always say we should be collectively the poster children to resilience. Because not only are we dealing with the sludge, we're doing amazing things. That's resilience, right? So it's important, thank you. So it's important that we understand that. There's another term that's come out that I have been very attracted to, and it's called the allostatic load. And it's about the work going on in neuroscience. And it's, again, this issue about stuff being in your bones. So what it's saying is that constant stress, so I talk about it, of the slow drip of oppression, like a leaky faucet, the slow drip of oppression. It just slowly, there's that constant drip. It creates heaviness on us. And I just read an article just last week, and it was talking about Black women experiencing the most severe levels of allostatic load, meaning our stress levels are multiple, they're on top of each other, right? And so we are experiencing that kind of stress. So it's important for us to not only talk about intergenerational trauma, but also to talk about intergenerational resilience, because regardless of those things that have occurred, even with the sludge, we are still amazing as human beings, as a collective group of human beings, and we need to celebrate that. It's important that we create ritual around that. It's important that we engage in public grief as a ritual, and I'm seeing people in this room do that. I didn't want to mention any names, but Nana Anawa does a lot of work around public ritual, and so you definitely want to seek out those healers among us who are doing that, who are bringing us to the point where we reclaim our humanity. We acknowledge it's important for us to grieve, for us to cry, for us to scream out, to be angry, and talk about those things, because only when we move through those things can we get to love and caring and empathy, right? And all of those things to fully experience the joy that we deserve. We have to move through things and be able to do that and become more fully human.
Thank you, Dr. West. So I think you brought us into the first question that I have, and again, I'm a millennial at the tail end of the millennial, but I'm still a millennial nonetheless. And there are generations after me as well. And we've been watching a lot of the stuff that's been taking place in media, right? We see the recent exchange with a lot of black celebrities. And I can't help in the work that I do to yell out, there are similarities between our communities. There are a lot of similarities between our communities. I'd like to hear from both of you on the similarities that you've found in communities that have faced these intergenerational traumas, or historic or cultural trauma or trauma DNA, whatever term we like to apply to it.
Well, I think Professor Cesare mentioned the post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think that the triggers are very similar in the community. So, for example, Holocaust survivors, when they see a policeman, they will go across the street. They are afraid of policemen. If they get stopped, I had one person came to me. He was stopped by a cop when he was driving, and the guy went berserk. And obviously, he then, received a court hearing and everything. And I had to write that this was a trigger from post-traumatic stress disorder, and that was the reaction to what he had experienced. So I think that that's sort of a lingering experience that not only the survivors have, but also their children have similar kinds of experiences in terms of certain triggers. The other is having to deal with any kind of authority. So if Holocaust survivors had to deal with you going to, any bureaucracy, even if it's, just a plain, governmental office, or, if they have to sign anything, they again have post-traumatic, they're going to be found out, they're going to be, who knows what they're going to do to them. It gets completely out of, proportion. Again, that's another trigger of anything having to do with authority is a very, very scary thing. The other has to do with, what kind of messages are the survivors giving their children, so that you have some survivors who have a message of you can't trust anybody outside of your own family, so that these individuals remain in a very close group, which, if you're trying to get into a loving relationship, the most important thing is having some kind of a sense of trust. And if you don't have that basic trust, how can you get into a loving, intimate relationship? And if you've been taught your whole life that you can't trust anybody outside your own family, that becomes a problem in having intimate relationship. And then I think the whole notion of replicating victim-oppressor kind of relationships. And I think that one of the things that happens to some children of survivors who remain in the feeling stage is what we call transposition. Transposition is living in the present, but creating a situation with psychological dynamics that relate to the past. So you have some children of survivors who may go from job to job to job, and they're always a victim, and there's always a persecutor. Or they put themselves into a situation that is dangerous and that they will have to survive it because generations before them survived something dangerous. And I think these are some of the similarities that...
Definitely. I would agree with all of that. I think the issues around identity are similar, that it's a complicated relationship with identity because we're living in an environment that doesn't appreciate who we are. So there's always this jockeying back and forth about, if I want to feel good about who I am, but a lot of times what it does is it distances me or it places me on the outside. I don't get the same privileges that other people get. and so on. Then at the same time, if I find myself accepted by the larger group, I find that I don't feel comfortable with who I am. I don't feel comfortable in my own skin. I don't feel as though I'm being authentic or genuine to who I am, and so on. There's the issue around history and about the need to teach history, the need to tell one's own story and not leave it to other people to tell the story about who you are. That's a similarity as well.
Yes,
The
absolutely.
problem is, once again, this issue around not ever getting to the end, to completion. So when you're still under siege, it's very difficult because you're just, it's like trying to hold on to sand. You know, you're trying to gather people and stuff, but they're still reeling from the racism. They're reeling from the trauma. They're reeling with distress. And it's hard to pull it all together because we're not at this place where we've crystallized our identity, where it's solid and sure and it's there. And every time we've tried, you know, in society, in history, in this country at least, and we've made some, you know, forward movements where we have our own organizations, right? When we think about some of the societies here, right? And we think about how we cared for ourselves. We had our own form of insurance. We had our own ways of doing things. We took care of those things. And the larger society doubles down on that. And almost, well, not almost, we do have stories of total obliteration of whole cities, right? So we know that there have been attempts to get to this place where we can move through to get to this point, but it's like gathering sand and being able to do that. So there are those similarities, but you know, we have a long way to go and a lot to be able to counter the forms of oppression, the intensity of the oppression, the endurance of the oppression, while at the same time trying to gather people and educate them so that they understand what's going on, what's happening to them, so that they can be more self-preserving, self-actualizing, and so on. So it's very difficult to do under the eyes, under the guise of the oppressor. So it's very difficult in that sense. But just the general day-to-day experiences, yeah, in terms of needing to teach your own history, the need to focus on one's own group identity and understanding that. Let me also just segue a little bit about this issue about group identity that is similar for both groups, is that we have over 30 decades, over 30 years, 3 decades of research around group identity and its relationship to healthy relationships, its relationship to reduced conflict interpersonally, to academic achievement. You know, it correlates with a lot of wonderful things. And yet, we don't see it serendipitously throughout our society. We don't see that. It's not in the schools. We look at the Title I schools. We look at schools where they're low resource and lots of black and brown children. Do you think that the curriculum is based on racial cultural identity development? It is not. And what is that about? You know, to understand that there is that strong correlation to health and wellness, and yet it's not there. So we need allies and we need advocates. We need workers. We need people who are willing to put their hands together and be able to work. We need to develop coalitions where we work with other people who don't have our story, but they have a similar story and they understand that. So we need to begin to do that because we're grasping at sand and we need support in order to move to the next level.
And you bring me to, I'm going to ask this last question, and I'll turn it over if there are any questions. We'll be able to take a couple questions from the audience. I can think back to my first time that I traveled to Jerusalem, and there were 2 places that stuck out for me in my visit. One was Yad Vashem. It was the first time as a black man that I experienced being connected to another community based on trauma. It was the first time I'm walking, in a very literal and figurative sense, I'm walking past this place where I'm seeing books that were burned, and I'm thinking about what's happening back home with the erasure of our history as black people in the school system. I'm looking at the anti-Semitic tropes through games. And I'm thinking about the games that were played historically in the United States. And how as you talk about it not being post-traumatic but past-traumatic, how it's not that far away, right? My mother integrated her school. And so I'm looking at that, and that was one place that stood out to me. The second place, a place called Natal, and they focus on trauma and dealing with trauma with different communities within the state of Israel and within Palestinian territory. And it stuck out for me because these are two separate communities dealing with separate types of trauma, but there's one place that is dealing with the trauma. And so my last question before we turn over to the audience is, how can a person recognize, one, when they're experiencing cultural trauma or historic trauma or intergenerational trauma, right? And the second part of that is, how can they identify when someone else is dealing with that same type of trauma? I think that that's a place that we can begin to work together as you talk about advocating and also being allies. And for those of us who are here in the room, you spoke a little bit about community grieving rituals. What type of community resources are available for intervention in things like this, as we talk about dealing with trauma? And if it's okay, we can start with
Sure.
Dr. Olatunde this time, and then swap back over to you,
Sure.
Dr. Fogelman.
Yes, so there is a Yoruba term called ore-ire, and it means realigning African heads. And so it's definitely about that we need to make sure that people are in their own right minds. And somebody has to define that, of what is that, what does it mean? I always ask people, I've taught counseling for 20-something years, and I always ask students, I ask my colleagues, is Black mental health the same as what we're reading in these books? I mean, are we headed in the same direction? Is anybody asking that question? So it's about understanding what is Black mental health, and there needs to be a checklist for people. People need to be able to ask, that's a great question. Yeah, we need to have that as a checklist. I would love to have that as a Post-it. Wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, and I got that checklist. Am I in my right mind? I mean it, right? Because we experience so many microaggressions in a day. And so we don't know who we are at the end of the day. And we have so many things coming at us from the media and the smartphone, and it's sending all these messages about things that are bright and shiny, that we have no idea who we are by the end of the day. And it would be great to have the very folks who help us to be well, to have a checklist to understand how to weed out those things and get back to who we are, and be able to do that. So this idea of thinking about, okay, what do we want to know? First of all, do I know who I am? Or am I accepting what someone else is saying, who I am? Do I know who I am? Do I have a positive relationship and attitude toward people like me? And does that attitude help me to recognize and appreciate people who are not like me, in that order? So don't start with I need to appreciate other people like me, but I don't appreciate myself. Something's wrong with that. So we start with, do I appreciate myself? Do I know who I am? Do I know where I come from, right? Those kinds of things. And then, does it help me to have great relationships? What I mean by that is that, do we have long-lasting, intimate relationships with friends and family? So, is that happening for me? Or am I stuck somewhere? And if so, then I know I need to seek out Eva and find out how can I get right and be able to do that. So I think that's it. Do I have community? I always say one of the great things I learned about growing up South is understanding who my community is. And I've had to think about that many times in the academy, of understanding who's my community, right? So I know that I'm sent to do that work. I don't do it on my own. I am representing other people, so that sense of belonging. So am I accepting the outer, world that's telling me that it's all about me? Or am I understanding I have purpose, I have meaning, and those kinds of things? And then also, do I restore myself? So how do we do that? Again, neuroscience talks about that, about how do you rewire your brain, and how do we do that? And there were ways in which we did that historically, and definitely within the African context. There's lots of that. I think about my parents growing up on my mother's side in Alabama, in the piney woods of Alabama, and they talk about having a church service where nobody says anything. They just moan for the entire service. Okay? Back in the day, that sounded weird. Today, everything I've been through, I'm battered and bruised.
Right.
I'm like, somebody give me the moaning bench, because I am ready for that. And now I understand that that's mindfulness, right? That's how we survived. We had our own ways of being mindful, of getting into that zone, getting outside of our bodies, and being able to do that. So I think that, when you ask the question, what can we do, or how will we know? There is a checklist that we can go through that can tell us what it is that we need to do. And there certainly are people. So we need to acknowledge that, because a lot of times we think we don't need to go and get professional help because nobody out there understands what we're talking about. But, you see, there are people out here who do get it, who do understand it, and can help you to move through.
And Dr. Fogelman, we want to hear from you. If I were to sit down in your office and say, am I experiencing intergenerational trauma? Am I experiencing, cultural trauma, or is there trauma in my DNA? If I were to sit down and say, what, is this what I'm experiencing? What would you advise?
Well, let me begin by just a little bit of a historical background to get to that point, which is that children of survivors, when they grew up, they felt different. They did not have the words to articulate what was different, and they thought that a lot of things that happened in their house might have seemed a little crazy, and it was not until Helen Epstein, journalist, child of Holocaust survivors, wrote a magazine piece called Children of Holocaust Survivors, and in June 19th, 1977, which was the magazine of the New York Times, it was read by 2 million people. And at that point, Children of Survivors got the words to articulate what it was they were feeling. And then they began to say, gee, I'm not so crazy, or my family was not so crazy. This was a normal thing for the family. Like, for example, hoarding food, or taking food with you wherever, you're going shopping, or, you're going to a big dinner. You want to make sure that you always have something to eat. And, it sounds crazy, but when you hear that that's how Holocaust survivors, were coping with their starvation, gee, my family is not so, is not so crazy. So that, and then her book came out in 1979, so that then more children of Holocaust survivors had the language to begin to articulate what it was they were feeling, and to give them a vocabulary about how to communicate about it. So one thing is certainly being in a group with other children of Holocaust survivors, hearing other people talk about it, ends up being very therapeutic in understanding. Now, I have children of survivors come to me. Sometimes they don't even know they're children of Holocaust survivors, and so they don't really see the connection of what they're experiencing that's related to the Holocaust. So me understanding, what it is, somebody who says, I can't go out and, spend a lot of money or buy myself new clothes, and, what comes to mind is, my parents wearing their uniform, and they had, nothing, and, here I am, I'm going to go to the store and spend this money. You have this, survivor guilt. They may not relate to, when they come in, they may just say, well, you know, I don't want to spend the money, you know, and they talk about the money. But when you take a look and begin to understand, you know, through therapy, you can begin to see all kinds of different ways in which it impacts them. Or children of survivors who as I mentioned earlier, put themselves in a dangerous situation in order to survive. They're not aware of the fact that this is what they're doing in terms of identifying with their parents. And so again, it is through the therapy, and what's very important about therapy is once you're aware that this is somehow related to your parents having been traumatized, having been persecuted as Jews, then you begin to say, well, how do I get away from this? How do I stop, you know, reliving my parents' experience in, you know, in my day-to-day life? Or, you know, you have men or women who, because of their heightened sense of empathy, that they grew up with being empathic towards their parents who suffered, will pick a relationship where the other person is suffering and they need to help that person. Or situations where they felt they couldn't ask their parents for anything or share anything that was painful. When they're in an intimate relationship, they have difficulty asking for anything that they want or complain about anything. So these are the kinds of things that people don't necessarily associate with the fact of, you know, what it was like for them. But once they begin to realize the connection between the parents' trauma and how they grew up, then they have a new understanding about their psychological dynamics, and that's one of the things that helps them heal. And the other thing that, you know, I always, in my work with, really this is with any patient, it doesn't matter if they're, you know, trauma-related or not, is what you talk about community. It is very important to be part of a community. Obviously, with the children of Holocaust survivors, the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, I try to get them to be involved in, you know, some part of the Jewish community. That's not always possible. I had one person who was so turned off to the Jewish community because his father had intermarried, and so so his mother was not Jewish, and wherever he went, people said, "Oh, you're not Jewish." And even though, you know, he felt very Jewish, his father was persecuted as a Jew, that he got so turned off to anything having to do with being Jewish. And when I suggested that, he kept saying, "Read my mind." And anyway, but if children of survivors or grandchildren are not interested in anything Jewish, I try to see what community they can feel a part of, because isolation is another form that's part of the post-traumatic stress disorder, is, you know, isolation. And also community and commemorations. One of the things that has been wonderful in certainly, I don't know, I guess the last, I don't know, maybe 30 years or something, is the commemorations that are taking place. That's an opportunity for mourning, and they're taking place all the way in the Rotunda in Washington, all the way to local institutions, and that has been a very healing experience. And just, you know, you talk about not having commemorations in the African American community. I just want to let you know that in there were no Holocaust commemorations. There wasn't a Holocaust Commemoration Day in the United States in the mid-1960s. So we're talking about 20 years after liberation. There were a group of people who had survived the Warsaw Ghetto, and in New York, and they went to every synagogue in Manhattan. We'd like to have a commemoration. Now, one synagogue would give them the space for a commemoration. So they went to Carnegie Hall, and they invited all kinds of actors and actresses to read from things like Anne Frank. And after a few years of that, they were so successful that then Temple Emmanuel in New York, which is a gorgeous synagogue, then allowed them to have a commemoration there. And when Rabbi Yitz Greenberg invited Elie Wiesel to speak in Riverdale, which is a little further up north from New York, there was maybe a handful of people that came to the commemoration, and those were, you know, elders, survivors. Nobody else from the community came to the commemoration, so that it took a lot of work to get people in understanding the importance of community and commemoration.
We can certainly continue this conversation between the three of us, but I want to open up the floor. If there are any questions, just wave. Oh, right here, good sir, and then right after you, we do have a floor mic. If there we go.
Yes. My name is George Mahdi. I'm a social activist. And, you know, trauma comes from the same condition, has the same features. But the way we got to that trauma is something different. You know, Jews, well, blacks in America are defined by color. Jews in America were defined by a religion. And, you know, part of the assimilation process, you know, most Jews were Europeans, so they assimilated into the society, you know, with less problems than blacks had. But blacks have maintained that you know, traumatic condition throughout, with that double, you know, what Du Bois calls the double consciousness. And through that, the pain that we have, I don't know, you know, we talk about the modern features of hypertension and so forth, but we also have that inferiority complex. We have that passivity, regression that, you know, was the product of white supremacy, because we were delegated to those roles that we couldn't pass out of. And, you know, that's where the experience differ, you know, whereas the Holocaust began in the 30s and lasted to the 40s. But you look at the state of Israel now, you know, they're the advantaged group in the, you know, and, you know, waging war on the Palestinians. So, you know, our expectations and our conditions and our place in society has changed, you know, but not in the black community, because we are still suffered and defined by color, and those have, you know, consequences of their own, and that we have the problems of disparities in education, getting jobs, you know, arrests, racial profiling, things of that nature. So we both share a trauma, but you know, we've been enduring it for 300 years, and you know.
Is there a question?
Well, not so much as a question, but you know, we're talking about the psychological aspects of race here, right? So I just wanted to bring that out in the sense that, you know.
And I do want to allow Dr. Fogelman a moment
Yeah,
to
I just wanted to say, even though being Jewish is a religion, Hitler's whole program was that Jews were a race. And then that's why, you know, he had all these measurements about the ears and the nose and, you know, and their hair. And so the Nazism was based on Jews being a race. And this is where, you know, the blacks are a race, and in terms of prejudice and the whole Nazi annihilation of the Jews is because we are a different race. And really it was like all you had to do is have one grandparent who was Jewish, and that, you know, and that made you Jewish.
And before we jump to the next question, I just want to say for me, learning, I'm much younger, it took a while for me to understand the Jewish community is an ethno-religious community, understanding that it is seen as a race. And again, I'm going back to visiting Yad Vashem. One of the things that stuck out to me was that in Hitler's studies, we talk about the Holocaust beginning in the 1930s, it actually, the studies, and it took place before then.
Right.
Hitler came to the southern portion of the United States to learn about what he was going to do. He got his ideas about what he was going to do from the United States of America and what was done to African Americans. And so I want to jump to our next question, but I just want to point out that it's so, and another part is, it's so easy for us to start getting into comparison between traumas and between oppressions, but it's really important for us to focus on, and that's why this conversation is so important, that traumas are traumas, right? It's important, as Dr. Fogelman pointed out, there's been an acknowledgement of Holocaust survivors and the traumas. It's important for us to acknowledge the sufferings and traumas of all communities. And I do want to jump to our next question for the sake of time.
Unless he tells you he's a Jew. But that's not the case with Black America.
Well,
I just have a comment to piggyback on
Yeah.
what you just said. To actually learn a little bit more about that particular comment, there's a great book called The Origins of Our Discontent
Yes.
by Isabel Wilkerson, I believe. And that actually will give a really great foundation in understanding really more of the conversation that we're having. So thank you for that comment.
And I appreciate yours as well. Thank you. Right here, sir.
Yes, my name is Stan Kessler. I'd like to comment.
Can you speak
on-
into the
can't hear
microphone a
you.
little bit
I'm
more for
sorry,
us?
my name is Stan Kessler. I'd like to comment on what you said. First of all, the Jews have had the legacy of trauma since the Exodus, my friend. And so we've experienced the hurt and the pain of slavery as you have, but not for 300 years, for 3,000 years. So we celebrate the freedom of slavery every Passover. If you're a good Christian, you will know that the Passover ceremony was attended by Christ. And why was he there? Because he was a good Jew. And because of that, he was celebrating the escape from slavery. So we have experienced and share with you the trauma of legacy, the legacy of trauma. That's number one. Number two, you made a comment about the Israelis confronting the Palestinians. There's not terror groups in Israel. It's a democracy, my friend. And the Palestinians are fomenting their own terrorism. I beg
So I
your
don't
pardon,
wanna-
let me finish, please.
I want to get to the questions that we have on
The question to you is, if you
So,
believe.
sir, I want to focus
See
on the
if he has a
questions to the speakers.
All right. So the question is, do you recognize the fact that we as Jews have experienced the legacy of trauma for 3,000 years? And we,
Why is he talking?
do you acknowledge that? The question
Sir,
do
is
you
your question
acknowledge-
for the speakers?
I'm sorry?
Is the question for the speakers?
No,
There's a question over there,
I'm
Aaron.
sorry.
I do want to make sure that we allow
Aaron,
people.
there's
Yeah,
an
we can
opportunity to-
continue questions. I mean, we can stand around and talk about afterwards. I definitely want questions, if possible, to be
Yeah.
focused on
For the
to
wonderful
speakers while
speakers.
they're here. I know that Dr. Fogelman's flying back to New York tomorrow morning, so we have her here in person. I really want to take advantage of
So we
that.
have time for about 2 more questions.
Dr. Fogelman, you had said something that was extremely powerful. You shared with me for the first time, I realized as a formerly incarcerated individual, how you said how a lot of the Jews did not share their experiences with their children and their grandchildren. And until you said that, it never dawned on me the fact that I spent almost 13 years in prison and I never shared my experiences with my children. I don't talk to them about it. It's almost as if it didn't even happen. You know, I came out and I've been on this path of being a super mom. And the reason for that is because I did not want my children to be ashamed of me because I had been to prison. So I've done everything humanly possible so that they would feel proud of me. But in that same vein, until I heard you just say it, it never dawned on me that I was doing the same thing. And so my question is, I don't know why. I don't understand why I do that. And it's not just me. You know, I know lots of formerly incarcerated. We don't do it. We don't talk to our kids about it. And there's no healing and no cure for prison trauma. And my focus is strictly prison trauma. That's it and that's all. But this right here has been very impactful. So if you could just give me some insights on what is going on maybe here that's not allowing me to be able to tell my children, because I just was thinking about my only daughter. I got 7 kids, one daughter, the last one. Her mother was snatched away from her at 8 years old. No explanation. Mommy will be back in a few days. Mommy didn't come back for almost 13 years.
Wow.
So I know that child had to have gone through some stuff, and then I just come back and just act like, oh, well, mommy's just been around the corner. Okay.
That's a really great question.
Right. Well, I think that part of, you answered your own question. You became a super mom, which is, what many Holocaust survivor mothers and fathers wanted to do. They wanted to, and to talk about having been incarcerated, to talk about having lived like an animal is very humiliating in front of your kids. And, this feeling of, being ashamed that, in your case, you incarcerated. The Jews were, incarcerated. If a small child hears, oh, you were incarcerated. What did you do wrong that you were incarcerated? And so parents want to feel like they want their kids to be proud of them. And so, if you hear, that a parent was, homeless, incarcerated, what kind of respect are you going to have for that kind of a parent? So one thing is that you don't want to begin talking about it when a child is very young. You want to wait till they're, in their teens, their late teens, their early 20s, and that's when you can begin to have a conversation about it. And also the reality was that children of Holocaust survivors did not really ask their parents any questions because they too felt that they didn't want to hurt their parents and maybe their parents will break down. And when I would ask children of survivors, why didn't you ask your mother, your father anything? They said, well, I was afraid they were going to break down and then what am I going to do if they... So what does break down mean? They were going to cry and I was going to cry. And so your children may also, maybe they know something, but they also don't want to put you in a position where you're going to be crying or that you will feel humiliated in front of them. But I think at a certain point in terms of having an intimate relationship, it will be good to talk about that. And just as an aside, one of the things that's happening to many children of Holocaust survivors, most of whose parents are dead today, there is this terrible feeling of not knowing. Why didn't I ask that? Why didn't I ask that? I can't believe I didn't ask that. And, it's like an annoying kind of feeling that, that they live with, so that your children may feel something similar, God forbid, at a certain point in their life as they, I don't know how old they are now, that, they never asked you anything or they feel that they really didn't know you. So being a super mom, which is what you did, I think that was the right thing to do. And as they're growing up, and then as they get a little older, you can begin to share, you know, what happened to you and what you did to, you know, to overcome it and begin a new life.
And thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah. To that. Yeah. So,
No,
yes.
can we just
yes,
that
yes,
helped me.
definitely.
Your question helped me because I'm sitting here similar as a child of someone who was formerly incarcerated, and also as a child of someone who grew up in Jim Crow South, thinking, why didn't I ever ask any questions? Right? You're talking about not telling the story, but equally, it's like, why didn't I ask any questions? And it goes back to something that you said earlier, Dr. Olatunji, is there's an African proverb that says, if the lions never tell their story, the hunters will, right? And so if there's no story that's told, then oftentimes what happens is we create our own stories or someone creates a story for us.
Very true, very true. I just want to add some cultural dynamics to it. So there are a couple of things. So one is that it's important to understand what it means to be a Black woman and to survive, and ways in which we're taught, inculcated into, you know, what it means to be a mother and so on. And so a lot of that is really about people just pick up and go on. You know, a lot of times because of our positionality, you know, our social positioning in this world, nobody wants to hear it anyway. That's the reality about where we are in society of not having that space to be weak, not having that space to be sad, not having that space to be able to talk about things and to weep for oneself, that this society doesn't give us space for that. What it does is give us a lot of space for being strong. So we tend to buy into that trope of the, you know, well, I'm just gonna pick up and keep going, right? Nobody cares anyhow, right? And we pass that on to our children. We pass it on to our girls about that, and they get the message that you don't talk about the hard times. You don't talk about what happened and be able to do that, but it can cause great harm to us to be able to do that. And so this legacy that it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it has helped us to survive. It's true, but it's been done on the backs of women. And so it's time for us to grow up as a people and say, you know, we don't have to survive on the backs of Black women, that we need to support Black women. And Black women need to also stand up and shake it off of like, nah, not today. You're not gonna be on my back today, right? Or, no, I'm not gonna be strong today. You know what? Y'all do it yourself. Today I'm taking a day off. I'm not doing it. So it's about coming into that consciousness of how am I positioned in society, right? And sometimes we do it without even thinking. Women in general, regardless of their ethnic or cultural background, tend to take on these serving roles. We tend to be that person. Things are on our backs, and we do that. For Black women, it's more extreme because we have all these other things as well that are weighing us down. So it's important to think about cultural context of how am I socialized to be, and how do I do that? So I've started to develop some interventions around this issue of historical trauma. And one of those is directing mothers to talk to their daughters about racism, about sexism. Woo, that is such a beautiful, heartfelt, funny, sad kind of experience to see them engage in that conversation because it's not being had.
Right.
And it can happen at every developmental level, just developmentally appropriate. So you may want to reach out to someone to help you to decide on what is developmentally appropriate, but you can begin that process of sharing stories, because in the process of doing that, you do intentionally communicate resilience, and they're gonna see that. So what they're gonna see when you tell that story, when you talk about how you've overcome, right? So that's womanism, womanist theory, you know, this idea of the reason why we need to talk about stuff is not to be angry, not to complain. We're telling this story because, you know, back in the old days in the black church, we have a thing called testifying.
Yeah.
And, oh, wow.
Determination.
Are we having church right now?
Yeah. Talk about determination so they can understand.
So it's like, that's what it is. And so when you talk to your daughter, it is a form of testifying. And in that particular theory, it says that's healing. That's healing. Talking about it, testifying. Because you're not only testifying what happened to you, you're also talking about how I got over, right? And that's the story that your daughter needs to hear, right? But in order to do that, you got to go through the fire. You got to, you know, give it up, be vulnerable, talk about it, and teach her vulnerability. And that, I think, is something that is culturally situated for you. So in addition to all the things that my sister Eva has said here, in addition to that, think culturally about how you want to transform what it means to be a black woman. And that's the wonderful thing about coming into your own, about self-actualization. All of a sudden, a silver wand comes out, and it's like, bam, I'm not doing that either. Bam, I'm not doing that either. You see, so you have the power to control your world. You can't determine how people treat you, but you can determine how you respond to what's happening to you. That's the power that you have. So you can rewrite that story by testifying with your daughter. Okay?
That's good.
Well,
You can't.
That's great.
You can't determine how people treat you, but you can determine how you respond.
Yeah.
That's good.
That's
That should
beautiful.
be a T-shirt. Last question, and we have,
Yeah.
and then will you all be around for a few
yeah,
moments
if there's
after?
more food and wine, yeah.
Yeah, they said we can bring it outside. The party's not over yet.
Please go out. Eva's book is out there, so you
I've been
should
eyeing
get
it
her
on the
book
table this whole time.
and get her to sign it for you like I am.
Good evening,
Yes,
ladies.
ma'am.
My name is Carol Berman. So I have a question for you, both of you. So as the legacy of trauma, as there's more evidence-based research that supports this, correct? Question number one is, what one thing you're seeing that maybe the United States government is doing to engage this more, to try and help those communities that are out there? And number two is, tell us the one thing that each of you believe that the government should be doing to try and treat this legacy of trauma, to, like, if not lessen it, eliminate it from the next generation from suffering from this.
Well, I think that I mean, I have to be very grateful to the United States government that President Carter set up a commission in 1978 to have a Holocaust museum, and some of the money came from the government and continues to come from the government to keep that museum going. I am grateful to the United States government for having a Holocaust commemoration at the Rotunda. And I am also grateful to the states that have made Holocaust education mandatory. I would like to see more money being poured into training teachers to teach Holocaust education, to teach the African American experience, the Native American experience. Obviously, when they teach American history, I think that you know, there has certainly, when I grew up, there was nothing in the books about the Native Americans, very little about African Americans. I think now some of the schools are having high school kids read some memoirs. But I'll let my sister here continue what you'd like to see the government doing. If you're asking me what I think the government should be doing for African Americans, I think there needs to be, it's very complicated in terms of, you know, the generations, but there needs to be some kind of a form of reparation. It might not be possible for individuals, but maybe for the community as a whole. And I will tell you that in Evanston, Illinois, which is really beautiful, is that they are giving subsidies to blacks to buy houses in Evanston, Illinois. And I think that's a beautiful form of reparation in that community that's being done by that small municipality.
Ditto. Yeah, I agree.
Is there another question?
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Do we have, I mean, we had one here and.
Can we?
What?
I saw one here,
I'm going
right?
to leave it. I'm going to leave it to the panelists. Are you everyone okay?
So
taking
can
one
we
or two?
borrow, if I can take a quick vote from the room? If you're in favor of us borrowing about 5 more minutes for a few more questions, please stay. If you're not in favor, we won't hold it against you if you leave. Okay, it seems like everyone's in favor.
Just do a couple.
I'm all right. I would like to invite everyone who has been the victim of contempt to look in the heart and let the heart open in love to others, because I think it's a much more powerful response to contempt. I have a quick story and then I have a question, which has been bothering me all my life.
Just for the sake of time, can we borrow your story after? And if you can just ask your
Well,
question.
I will tell you the story very quickly because it's part of the question. There's a group in Louisiana that has been the victims of prejudice for about 100 years, and I belong to that group. That's the French group, and we're all colors. And we've been put down for about 100 years. I grew up thinking I didn't belong in the world, didn't have any right to power in it, and most of my family does. So to make that story short, this is my question. How many generations do you think this trauma you are talking about might be transmitted, either culturally or neurologically?
I don't know what he's asking.
His question, so just to reiterate the question is how many generations does this trauma pass along? So he's speaking about the
okay.
French group, which is, it transcends race, so it's both black and white. And there are members of the community, including members of my family, that experience trauma from this group. He's asking, how long does this trauma tend to last?
Well, you know, the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, and then they were in the desert. After they got out of Egypt, they were in the desert for 40 years. And so that makes it 2 generations. Each generation is considered like 20 years. And the reason they were in the desert, you know, because it certainly didn't take, you know, 20 years to go from Egypt to, you know, was the land of Canaan in those days. But God felt that it would take 2 generations for the slaves generation to be able to know what freedom is all about, so that by the time that they got to Canaan, most of the slave generation had already died. So this was a new generation that was coming in. And so I think, you know, we see that with the Holocaust survivors, in that the 3rd generation has a different kind of a feeling towards what happened. It's easier for the grandparents to talk to their grandchildren, for grandchildren to ask their parents questions. But when it comes to the African Americans, their persecution has not ended. So you can't, you know, so we can't think about, I don't know about your group, but, you know, when it comes to the African Americans, their persecution has not ended. And I was at I'll just take one more second, I was at the World War II Museum today. And the thing that struck me the most is that 500,000 African Americans served in World War II in a segregated army.
Yeah.
And then they used them to clean latrines, and they kept them in England, and clean. And then they finally needed them for the liberation, particularly the engineering group. When they returned back to the United States, they, obviously had a plane that brought them back to the United States. They could not get a taxi to take them to where they were living. And so, this is what they faced after having served their country. And, we tend to think of lynching happening God knows when. There were lynchings that took place after World War II. So that, we can talk about
Last year,
we could talk about,
this year.
we could talk about, when does the transmission stop? We cannot talk about when the transmission is going to stop with the African Americans. And, when you talk about transmission is also values and worldview. And there are values and worldviews that are not that are not necessarily negative ones. And, we talk about resilience, so that it's not just, when we talk about the post-trauma life, the post-trauma life is not necessarily all negative. And so, it's not like getting over the trauma, because there are wonderful things that, certainly, I learned from my parents, and I'm sure Cecily learned from her parents, that, we want to carry from generation to generation.
Yeah, so the idea is that until we're able, I started thinking about a Bob Marley song, I'm sorry, but it's like until we're able to, one, be able to stop the oppression, that's one. So again, what we're hearing Eva say is that it just continues. It's difficult for it to stop. So it's being able to advocate, to resist, to be able to stop that from happening. And then you also need to have work going on within the community to undo the impact of the oppression. So there have to be people who are doing that. Not all of those people are the healing people. We're talking mental health here, but there are also spiritual leaders. Some of you are in the room. But it's also our artists, and be able to do that. So, I'll just give a shout out. One of the reasons why I said, Aaron, you have to have Dr. Michael White to be able to do it. I don't know if you've ever gone to any of his presentations where he explains the music and talks about the music as a form of resistance, and being able to talk about that. And so I saw that as a nice compliment to what it is that we're talking about. So you need to have lots of people within who are working toward the healing of the people, and you also have to have the resistance. So people need to be actively resisting the oppression. But the first part I said always, before you start joining, before you start loving, you first have to, differentiate. You have to remember who you are. So there has to be the resistance first in order for you to get the thing to stop. But people need to be aware and conscious.
It's already 8:30. Oh, God.
To know that the oppression is occurring. So there's work. You have to do the work within. This is evident not just here in the U.S., not just among African Americans or talking about Jewish people here. I just got back from Australia and New Zealand. In Australia, I was talking with a lot of Aboriginal scholars who are talking about being within the African diaspora and talking about the issues they're dealing with. And they are the oldest continuous non-white civilization in that whole region of the globe. They are honored for that, but they are greatly oppressed, right? No respect for the value that they have as human beings on the planet. And so there's lots of work, and they experience a lot of things we've talked about here. Whether we're talking about the Jewish community or the Black community, they're experiencing those things. In New Zealand, I was with the Maori people, and they are talking the same thing, talking about that. about the things that they're dealing with and trying to resist the oppression, trying to educate within because they're experiencing that. So I say it's going to continue ad infinitum until you make it stop. So that's why it's important for us to work hard, to resist, to form coalitions with other like-minded folks to move forward and be able to do it in order for good to conquer bad.
And I promise this is really the last question. We'll be out
Yes.
right after the
Oh,
program
yeah,
if you all want to continue the questions, or if you all have any more questions. Last question right here, and then I promise we'll be able to talk right outside the door.
My name is Ann Levy, and I happen to be a survivor. This is my daughter, the second generation that's sitting here. And so it's very interesting to me, the comparison that we're making here today. But I don't want to talk about it. I'll tell you one little story that happened to me being a white teenager that came to New Orleans, going to school on a bus. And I've always been taught that you have to give elderly people your seat if there's no seat. I happened to be on this bus, and an older black woman came on a bus, and I wanted to give her my seat, but I couldn't because that little sign that said colored, I was not allowed to do what I thought was right. The other thing that is so important, and especially at this time that we're living in, is for the Jewish and the black people to realize that they're fighting for the same thing. We're still fighting for anti-Semitism, Justice Week, Justice Day, whatever you want to, we're still fighting it. It hasn't ended. I never thought that my children would be ever made different because they were Jewish. So I thank you for listening to me, but I had to put my 2 cents in.
Thank you for your 10 cents. That was good. That was really good. That was really good. I think you raised a really great point, and it's a really important point for us to end tonight's discussion on, is that the trauma that we're facing is not isolated to one community. It's not isolated to one race. It's not isolated to one ethno-religious group. It's not isolated to one gender or one sexuality. Trauma is trauma. And I think that tonight we've been provided a lot of great insight into how we intervene, how we acknowledge it, right? How we advocate for those who are dealing with trauma, how we become advocates for our own trauma, how we become allies for those dealing with trauma, right? But we have been blessed to be in the presence of 2 amazing experts. So I just wanted you guys to show just a little bit more love for Dr. Fogelman, Dr. Otunji. I have been blessed. Yeah, I agree with you, sir. This has been nothing but amazing. So thank you both.
And
both,
thank you, Wendell.
Yes,
You were
it's my pleasure.
fabulous.
It's
You
my
were
pleasure.
fabulous.
So I know we'll be right outside after. Aaron, are there any remarks that you'd like to make before we?
No, that's it. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight.
What's today's date, November?
Just, my name's Aaron Block. I'm the executive director of the Goldring
Okay.
Family Foundation Center for Jewish Multicultural Affairs. We are just so happy to be relaunching this series in person. This is the first of a series of 3 programs we do every year with HBCUs in New Orleans. So we'll be at Dillard and Suno in the spring. Thank you all for coming out. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
You were such a great chair compared to what we had this morning. Oh, you're so fabulous. Wow, amazing.
That was awesome.